You're listening to Parasearch Radio. News, views and reviews from the world of the paranormal from across the UK and beyond. Find us on Facebook, Twitter and the World Wide Web. The views and opinions expressed by presenters and guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Parasearch Radio or their affiliates and sponsors. Listener discretion is advised.
Good evening and welcome to the special interview show. Tonight is a topic that is sobering and scary at the same time. Tonight I'm joined in the studio by Haunted Histories presenter Penny G. Morgan. Good evening, Penny.
Hi Kerry, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you. Now, I want to know, first of all, before we get into the topic really, how did you feel whilst you were researching this?
A combination of disbelieving, thinking it was fiction, and, in all honesty, wanting my kids and my husband so tight they couldn't let go. That's, talking personally, if we want to sort of elaborate on that, there have been tears. There have been having to read things more than once to check I haven't misread figures and things like that. But a general feeling of this can't be real, even though I know it is and was, and wanting to hold my kids and my husband as close as possible. It's a weird way it affects you. I mean, I always felt I knew a reasonable amount about the Holocaust. It's not something I've ever had. My parents have never shied me away from learning about it, even as a teenager. I knew that Auschwitz had been where lots of people died from quite a young age. But delving into it even further, to put the background together for a show like this, all I'll say is, I say this to people, it's a horror film, and it's worse.
Yeah.
As simple as that. You cannot. I think if someone made a horror film up of what happened during the Holocaust, and people didn't know about the Holocaust, nobody would believe it. They'd think it was made up. Mm-hmm. It's that bad. That bad.
Yeah. I mean, I have to say, I was the same as you. Many times I ended up in tears and had to walk away from the topic for a while, ground myself, come back to it. Yep. Disbelief at some of the images that you see when they're out there. It's like, it's so hard to actually comprehend the reality of this situation. It is one of the most horrifying parts of history that I think I've ever come across in depth, where I've had to research something in depth like this. And I think the overriding thought for me was how and why. Why? I don't get it.
There isn't. I don't think. I mean, I was having the blog I did recently about the Dutch resistance girls, the two sisters. Uh-huh. I was having quite an in-depth conversation with someone who I know from Saracens Rugby Club about this, and it transpires she'd lost relatives in the camps, and as had her husband. I never realised that. I didn't realise they were Jewish. Obviously, it's not something they don't turn around and say, "Oh, by the way, do you still want to talk to me? I'm Jewish." It's not. I didn't realise that this lady was, and we were having a really in-depth conversation about it, because one of my real bugbears. Historically, not what happened then. I mean, everything is a bugbear what happened then, but is people who don't believe it, or who try and tell other people, no, it's a load of made up stuff. It didn't really happen. Those tapes, they're not real. And that's something I do get very, very emotional about. Even though I have no Jewish heritage, as far as I know, I didn't lose anyone in my family in those camps. I didn't even have any family liberate the camps, the ones at like Bergen-Belsen that the British went into. Mm-hmm. But it's that sense of overwhelming extermination that I can't understand, and I want to try and work out and give people almost like the benefit of the doubt. Like, how could you be made to believe that people who follow a certain religion are all bad and they deserve not to be on the face of this earth? And her and I were having this conversation, and she was saying, because I was telling her about a case when it was about must have been about 20 years ago, and it was some kind of anniversary, and the museum I was at, it was Eden Camp in Yorkshire, amazing museum, and they had a feature on the Holocaust, and they had all these photos, a lot of the famous ones that you and I will have seen doing our research, the ones that, because sadly there's actually not as much evidence as people think.
I know.
Because the Nazis destroyed as much of it as possible, and they weren't supposed to have cameras, and even the Russian Red Army weren't supposed to have cameras when they were liberating these Majdanek and Auschwitz and all of that. And so these photos you do see the same ones over and over again. Every so often some new ones come in which break your heart all over again, but you kind of say, I know that image, like the image of the children. I think the two twins, Eva Moses Kaur was one of them. They're standing at the barbed wire when the Russians got there. That's quite a famous photo. And this woman was talking to her son, and he must have been about 13 or 14, and he was getting really upset looking at these photos. He was saying what you and I have just said, like, Mum, why would someone do this? Why would they think this is acceptable? And she turned around and she said, don't worry, it's not real, they've made it up.
But SS Officer Growing came out and is actually talking about his experiences to say it did happen. I was complicit in that. Yes, it happened. You know what I mean? Because he was worried that people were saying it's fake, never happened, it's just propaganda. And even an SS officer is saying that.
Yeah, so was Rudolf Höss, who, even though he was a narcissist, he had no empathy or whatever, he actually was, I know we're sort of jumping around in history here a bit, he was the commandant of Auschwitz for most of its time, I suppose we could say. And we'll talk about some of this background history in a sec, but he was asked by the Polish government when he was imprisoned by them to write his biography, to get the information down. Yeah. And he actually wrote a personal letter to his son saying, I still believe in the Nazi Party. I still believe in, standing up for ourselves. I'm paraphrasing this, but I still believe in standing up for ourselves. But the one lesson I want to give you, son, is don't always believe what the hierarchy tell you. Question it. And most people have taken that to believe that he started to question, was it really right?
Like
murdering all these people.
Yeah, it was almost like,
small, tiny amount.
Small amount of remorse, but it wasn't. He wasn't remorseful.
He wasn't remorseful, but he started to question, maybe I should have pushed back a bit and not murdered all these people and cultivated better and more efficient. I mean, let's face it, one of the jokes about the Germans is they're the most efficient race out there, and sadly what happened with this showed that to be actually accurate. But this woman, she told her son, he was a teenager, which in my view, and he didn't have any special needs or anything that I could see, is old enough to learn about this. Maybe not some of the nitty-gritty that you and I will have been reading up on, but the basic facts of what happened, the genocide, the murder. And I lost my temper. My then boyfriend heard her say it and went, no, Penny, please don't, please don't, please don't. I just went over to her and I tapped her on the shoulder. I can't really remember what I said. I was that angry. But I said, it's people like you that denigrate the memories of people who survived this, and also the memories of the people who didn't, by telling your children that it didn't exist. And I apparently reduced her to tears. I don't remember. I didn't see red to the point I was yelling, but I don't really remember what I said. And she walked out crying, left her son, who promptly came over to me and said, could you tell me about it, please? So I proceeded to give him a somewhat sanitised lesson, but taught him about it and mentioned some of the camp names, so Sobibor, Treblinka, Bergen-Belsen. Obviously not all these would be actual death camps, but the camps in general where people died. And hopefully he went off and looked it up for himself. But that's what worries me, is when people sort of, because they can't cope with it, or they genuinely believe it can't have happened, nobody could have done it. How could you get away with killing 3, 4, 5 million people? Nah, it can't happen. But it can, and it did. And its impact is one of the things we're going to talk about, isn't it? The immediate impact after the liberation.
Yeah.
The impact is still there now.
Yeah.
And I think that's what people don't realise. And I mean, I say we'll talk about some of the impact on individuals, but it's just one of these things that it's. I genuinely don't understand people who say, "Nah, didn't happen. It's fake."
Yeah, I don't understand it all, but I think you have to understand the German ideology at the time, Hitler's ideology at the time of the superiority of the German race. You have to look at the political landscape coming off the back of World War One and the restrictions placed on Germany, the hardships Germany went through financially after the World War, which allowed someone like Hitler to come to that kind of power, and then put it in context, and actually there are huge lessons that people need to learn from this, from this. But I kind of want to go back to, I started my research with, I knew that World War II started by Germany invading Poland.
Why we came in, yes. They had invaded other areas before then, and we'd signed an agreement with them.
That's right.
Chamberlain.
But this is where it started for us, and I didn't understand why Poland. Germany would invade Poland. But it was actually to regain the lost territory that they'd lost. And they wanted more living space for the Germans.
That's it. They wanted more Lebensfrei, so free space. That's what they were looking for. Yeah.
That's right. And Hitler's modus operandus of warfare, as you said, we talked about the efficiency of Germany in warfare. Now, obviously, we're not talking about the war in general. This is all getting to the point of how this occurred for Auschwitz in particular. Yeah. And I'd just like to point out at this point that there are plenty of other camps. We're talking purely about Auschwitz tonight in this respect, because today marks the 75th anniversary of the liberation. Mm-hmm. Now, Hitler's modus operandus for war was basically to blitz bomb, right? So he would basically wipe out production, transport, communication, munition dumps, air support by blitzing, from the air. Bomb, 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 bomb. Cripple the country's structures, internal structures for retaliation, and then massively move land troops in. Mm-hmm. To give you an idea, within 1 day of the invasion of Poland, this is how efficient it is. He'd set up security SS death head regiments to terrorise the remaining population. That's how efficient he was. That's how much he wanted to subjugate, is that the right word? The Polish community into Germanic rule, effectively.
Yeah.
With this in mind... Oh, hang on, I've got a big...
Is that your mic?
Yes, sorry. Apologise for that. That's
me. That's better.
That's better. There you go. Sorry about that, everybody.
You've got the headphones on and you can hear that through.
I know, I was thinking, is that me or is that you? Solved that one now. With this in mind, he was looking, or they were looking for suitable camps, we'll use the word, to put anybody that was against them in. Now, bearing in mind, he wanted to use Polish people as basically a slave race for the German cause.
Yeah.
So it didn't start off, did it, as a death camp?
No, you can actually go back even further. I mean, the originally when it was Polish, it wasn't actually called Auschwitz. The Polish name for it, and I hope to any Poles listening I'm pronouncing this right, because I did write down the phonetic spelling, is Oświęcim. Oświęcim. It's actually spelled Oswiecim, and it was pronounced Oświęcim. And it originally in 1917, the first, because there's three there's actually something like 60 sub-camps to Auschwitz, but there's the three main camps, and this is when the first one was built, and it was originally built, it was built as a camp for seasonal workers, Sachsenjäger, which was basically a word saying people on their way to Saxony. And that's what they built it as. And ironically, in 1919, it became a refugee centre for those displaced during World War One. It wasn't until, and then it became a garrison, which is why some brick buildings, you can tell they're garrison buildings when you look at them in Auschwitz 1. It wasn't until 1940, after the invasion of Poland, a year or so after, that Himmler actually noticed it. Now, they had their other camps, some of their other camps up and running, and I know you said this is about Auschwitz, I'm not talking about the others, but, places like Chełmno, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, Majdanek, they were all up and running as death camps before Auschwitz was. And Auschwitz was noticed in 1940 by Himmler, and one of the things they liked about it is, even though some of the ground around it was a bit boggy, was marshy and all that kind of thing, they figured they could get train lines down, because it did have a train line nearby that they could build the spur. It had water, it had coal nearby, and all these kind of things. They felt they needed to run a camp, because at the time it was before the final solution had really began, and what they call the movement, and I mentioned this in the new blog I've written, I think it's going up at the end of this week. They wanted to create an environment that was what they called Judenfrei, which means free of Jews. And you know, I know some of this language, it really makes me cringe as I'm saying it, but it's what it was. It's history ain't always fun. And it was in the May of 1940, I believe, that they appointed the first leader of Auschwitz, being Rudolf Hess, as it's sometimes pronounced. But the first people who went in there, it was used as a transit camp for predominantly Polish political prisoners, and to segment people, because they were all in the one camp. I think it was designed to hold about 7,000, if I remember sort of off the top of my head. It was about 7,000. But they all had to wear different triangles determining what they were. So, I mean, we know the yellow Star of David that Jews had to wear. Well, initially they'd have a yellow triangle, but if they were Polish Jews, they had to have a P on that triangle. You would have red triangles for political prisoners. You would have green for criminals, black for antisocials, which would mean prostitutes, or the gypsies, the Roma and Sinti gypsies, who were, people forget, they were attacked mercilessly. He wiped out something like 7/8 of those gypsy communities in Europe during World War II, and people forget about those. You had the purple for Jehovah's Witnesses, you had pink for homosexuals. Oh yes, homosexuals were classed as enemies of Germany, and they were put in there too. And then obviously the yellows, and then also shortly after that, and I think it was around sort of mid 1941, they started sending the Soviet POWs when the Russia sort of changed sides and stopped saying, okay, we're behind you, Hitler, and went to fight for the Allies. And they started sending them, because it was right on the border of the Soviet Union. So it wasn't there, even though as it went on, what's really scary when you look, and I know we've got these dates to look at, but what's really scary is people think it was always Jews going in there. That's the common misconception I find when I ask people. But when I tell them, well, no, the Jews didn't start going in until about 2.5 years before the end of the war, it's like, and we're going to talk figures because I think we have to.
Later.
But
got a lot to get through before then. You're jumping ahead.
I know. What I was going to say is people seem to think it was always there for the Jews. And when you look at the history of it, I find it even more terrifying that it wasn't. It was until it had been running for about half of its life, if you like, that the Jewish intake started coming in. And to look at the numbers of those that they went through and they murdered, that's terrifying.
It is totally terrifying. I mean, it's worth pointing out at this point that concentration camps are different from death camps. Concentration camps are basically holding centres for those kind of people to start with. And then death camps became the extermination side of things. Yeah. Auschwitz started as a concentration camp and then moved into becoming a death camp. And they a lot of the trials they did for the mass exterminations were done at Auschwitz with the gas chambers and the
Zyklon B.
Thank you.
Yes, all right. They started off, and I don't mean to sound as excited about talking about this. This is my way of masking how sick it makes me feel. They started off with these mobile gas chambers. Yeah. And these were basically lorries, like transport lorries, that they would use the carbon monoxide from the exhaust pipes to gas as many people as possible. But as the numbers started to increase, they needed to find a better way. And it was actually in the September of 1941 at Auschwitz that they devised the Zyklon B way. And it wasn't Hess who did it. It was his second in command. And so yeah, it's easy to tag them all in the concentration camp thing because they were all camps. And in a way, even the concentration camps were death camps because people did die. But they weren't extermination camps, and that's why sometimes I use the word extermination, because as horrific as it is, it kind of distinguishes. It's not just somewhere where people die. It's somewhere where they're deliberately murdered.
Yeah.
And that's...
And that's the point, I think. I mean, enforced labour on minimal rationing, I mean, not even minimal, I mean, we're talking like nil rationings, lack of water, you know, that sort of thing went on in the concentration camps. And we're not detracting from the horrific, the horrifying circumstances that people were working and living under. But death camps were the selection process and shipping straight through to the gas chambers and stuff like that. That was an actual process of deliberate extermination of people within it. And Auschwitz was one of these. Now, oh gosh, it is horrifying when you look at this. It is absolutely horrifying. Now, in 1941, Soviet prisoners of war was being sent to the camp, as you said. Now, the first mass killings happened in September of that year in Auschwitz II, which at this time wasn't that big.
No, it wasn't. It was Auschwitz I. It was the punishment block. It was the punishment block at Auschwitz I. Auschwitz II hadn't actually been completed by then.
I found Auschwitz II. I found references to Auschwitz II on this one. So maybe there's a little bit of, discrepancy there.
Yeah, they started the bit from the research I did. They started the building at Auschwitz II. Auschwitz II, they used the original. They used two farmers' cottages as the original centres where they'd send people because they were slightly away from the camp. This was before they built the infamous crematoria and the shower blocks. They built these quasi-pretend shower blocks in these two cottages and bricked up all the walls and put gas-proof doors in. But the first time they tried it, it was actually in the what they call the punishment block at Auschwitz I, which is still there.
I see. I read it I did read that as Auschwitz II, and then the success of that led them to then build more at Auschwitz II because it was so successful.
Yeah.
And that mass killing was about 600, roughly. I mean, this is approximately because, like Penny said, a lot of the evidence and was, destroyed by the Nazis before they left the camp was around 600. So it's an approximate figure. But still, horrifying experiment to undertake with that thought in mind.
And what's even more horrifying, and this because they were guinea pigs. They were guinea pigs. The officers who were doing it, they'd had this idea that because Zyklon B, they realised it was poisonous because it was a rat killer, it was vermin killer, and they realised, well, this gives off gas. Therefore, if we use it in the right quantities, we can kill people without getting our hands dirty. Because before then, they were shooting people. They were still killing people. They were shooting them in the back of the neck. Yeah. But they realised that was actually poor things. That was having a toll on the soldiers who were having to do the shooting and then clearing the bodies up. Because, oh dear, that was having a toll on them. You can't see my face I'm pulling right now, and anyone who's listening, but it's kind of, oh, poor them, that was having a toll on the soldiers. So they wanted to do these ways that were going to be more efficient Germans. It's not a bad thing, but in this case it was. And someone, and I can't remember who it was one of them that suggested, well, this stuff is poisonous, wonder if we can use it on humans. And so they rounded up all these Russians, and there were some Polish prisoners as well, into the basements of the prison, the punishment block, and started pouring this stuff in. But they didn't know how much to use. And it went on for hours as they would pour a load in, realise they'd murdered some of the men, and then pull those ones out, or sometimes they'd pull them out, if not they left them. And it took all night to kill all the men eventually. So can you imagine the mental turmoil, those people who didn't die straight away? They knew something was happening. They were being killed. And I can't... They apparently they had to barricade the doors because the prisoners were trying to break their way out. Not surprising, really, is it? So these initial experiments, and then it was then that they prepared the report, and I believe they then reported back to Hess when he came back to the camp and said, "Oh, we found this way," and he then put a report together for German High Command, telling them all about it. And but they did still try some of the initial methods at Auschwitz-Birkenau. Camp 2, they did still try to use carbon monoxide as an experiment to see if that would work as well. It's unbelievable that we can talk about this. They were using it as an experiment. It was an experiment.
Yeah.
You know.
Just like you do.
these people weren't human. They were experiments.
They were so bought into that ideology of supremacy of Germans, and that anybody who wasn't under that shouldn't be around, shouldn't be alive, really. There was no embracement of other people's opinions or belief systems or anything like that. It was our way or the highway, basically. And that mindset. That mindset is just crazy. I mean, to put it into context in regards to the Soviets, prisoners of war that were there was roughly around 2,000. By the February...
No, 10,000.
No, sorry, 10,000. By the February, it was 2,000. So 8,000 Soviets had gone by then.
Yep. And then it got worse.
And then it got worse.
A month later.
A month later.
945. And then 2 months after that, 186 of the original. So by May of 1942, there was only 186 of the original 10,000 Soviet prisoners of war, soldiers, who it should have been, I think, is it the Geneva Convention determines how you're supposed to treat POWs? And that dates back to World War One. Hitler was in direct contravention of it, and he murdered these men. And so when you look at it, now, when you look at the statistics, I've got the actual statistics all round of the Soviet soldiers in World War II. There was something in the region of 5.7 million soldiers captured, Soviet soldiers. Of that, 3.3 million died. Now, bear in mind, they didn't go to war with Germany until mid 41. 3.3 million died of those 5.7. 2 million of those were by February of 1942. So within a year, there was 2 million of them dead.
That's just the Soviets, everybody.
Just the Soviets.
That's just the Soviets at this point. That's just the Soviets, because in January of 1942, this gives you, and the numbers are crazy that you cannot comprehend.
They are, aren't they?
You can't comprehend the figures that are the amount of people that are passing through they're not passing through, they're going into these camps. In January of 1942, 100,000 Jews, men, and 50,000 Jewish women were deported from Germany to Auschwitz as forced labourers, allegedly. Upon arrival at Auschwitz, the SS killed all of them. That's not including the Soviet numbers we've just talked about.
Nope.
And that is in a really short space of time, bearing in mind that the construction of Auschwitz II started in October of 41.
Yep.
That is a huge amount of people going through those gas chambers in a very short space of time.
And bear in mind, these would have been the two huts I told you about, the two farmers' cottages. And what they would do to try and stop other prisoners hearing the screams, they would make sure all the car engines were running, all the lorry engines were running, and trying to make as much noise as possible so the other prisoners didn't get wind of what was going on.
Yeah. Now, Auschwitz itself is actually split into 3 sites. The 3 main. You said there were plenty of sub-camps as well.
That's 60, I think I read,
That's right. There's a huge amount of sub-camps as well. But they tended to be more labour camps, focused on buildings, like munitions and stuff like that. But the 3 main sites of Auschwitz, so you've got Auschwitz I, which was mainly for political prisoners. And this is where the main gates, the main gates that's very iconic. And I'm not even...
Arvid Mike Frey.
Thank you very much.
Arvid Mike Frey.
Work makes
you
free.
Work will set you free.
Yeah, that's that's Camp 1.
Yeah.
And that is only supposed to hold 15, or designed to hold, should we say, 15,000 to 20,000 people.
It was also where the Germans' barracks were themselves, where a lot of the German soldiers lived. So even if they covered some of the other camps, that's where they would go back to at night, or whatever.
Birkenau, Auschwitz-Birkenau, which is Camp 2. Now, that's where the majority of the Auschwitz victims died. And, how many people go through there? I mean, come on.
Nobody knows for sure.
The figures are absolutely crazy. Well, I'll tell you about that in a moment. And as I said, in 1942, bearing in mind, when did it end? 1945, the camp was liberated.
45, yes.
So in 3 short years...
Yeah.
They believe 1,300,000 people arrived and 1,100,000 people died at this camp.
Yep.
Out of that, and again, the figures, we don't even know. We can't, they're so estimated. I found so many different sources and so many different figures on this, but they reckoned around 15,000 Soviet prisoners, 21,000 gypsies, 70,000 Polish, over 1 million Jews, 200,000 of those were children.
Yeah.
Many other Jehovah's, like you said, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, political prisoners were held there as well. Now, we could go on and on about the atrocities that happened within these camps. But I kind of, when we looked at doing this show, I kind of thought, what happened after? What happened in the camps, and whilst it was running as a death camp, is very well documented. People are very aware of the atrocities that happened. But I wanted to know what happened upon liberation. I wanted to dive into what happened afterwards, because you can imagine you're a soldier, you're fighting the Germans, you're beating them, you're battling them back. What happened afterwards to the people that they found, to the camp that they found? What state was it in? What happened to those people? And that's really what I wanted to do. So we're going to jump now.
Okay.
We're going to jump a little bit to January of 1945. I want to go to where the Soviets are advancing towards Auschwitz, and scouts first come across it.
Yeah. Well, I'm just going to jump back 2 months, because in the November of 1944, right, there is a reason I'm saying this. Actually, I'm going to go back to October. In October, a group called the Sonderkommando had an uprising at Auschwitz, and they demolished one of the crematorium. They smuggled explosives in from one of the armories that prisoners were working at to destroy it. Now, the Sonderkommando, for anyone who doesn't know, were Jews whose job was to clear the gas chambers once they'd been murdered and put them into the crematorium. So you've got Jews clearing murdered Jews. I mean, but they had an uprising. They stood up for themselves. Now, quite a lot of them died as a result of it, as you can imagine. But that was kind of the start of it, because it was shortly after that there was the last mass, as they call it, Jewish transportation. I think it was something like the 30th of October 1944 was the last mass Jewish influx into the prison. And then in November of 1944, Himmler ordered a cease on the murders, although he called them the exterminations, but let's call them what they were, the murders. Now, that was because about 6 months beforehand, the Russians had liberated, I think it was Majdanek, one of the other camps, and they knew they were coming, so they were starting to get scared. So they started destroying the camp. They also started marching a lot of the remaining prisoners, the ones who weren't ill or children, on death marches to get them to some of the other camps further west that hadn't yet been liberated. So that's kind of going on in the interim. So all the people that the Red Army found would have been children, especially children who'd been experimented on in the hospital wings, and people who were too ill or too frail to walk. Now, there are stories, it's told that the soldiers who were left guarding, the Germans who were left guarding, were told to kill everyone, leave no trace. But most of them, and I've read accounts saying, I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it. I can't sit there and shoot a baby in their bed. I can't do it. And they hightailed it out of there, because they knew if the Russians caught them, they knew what the Russians would do to them, especially the amount of Russians they'd probably killed. So that's the scene that you've got the Red Army going into. They are going into not just a scene of some of the people who are still able-bodied, but weak and frail and everything else. They have got children and people who basically are, and I'm not saying this kind of trite in any trite way, dying. They've not just got the kind of the younger prisoners who are being marched now, death marched away from the camp to kill as many off as possible on the way, like 300 kilometre walks. They are faced with young children, so children up to about the age of 14, who've been experimented on, who are malnourished, who have got no parents, who have got nothing apart from each other, and people who are dying in their beds. It was rife for things like typhus and all those kind of illnesses that you get when you get people in an overly crowded, unsanitary place. So that's what the Russians found when they walked through those gates. Now, the gates weren't guarded. They literally pushed them open because all the Nazis had gone. I think they might have found a few that they arrested, but not many. And bear in mind, at one time, I think there was over about 1,000 officers covering these sites, or soldiers covering these sites, if not more. So they were able to literally walk in. And I remember I read a story in a book I read called The Forgotten Voices of the Holocaust, and this girl said, the soldier said to me, "There's nobody guarding you, why didn't you just leave?" And she went, "I didn't know I could."
Yeah.
She was so, even over say a year there, she was so ingrained as to what the rules were to survive, she didn't try and push anything. And that to me is kind of because apparently the soldiers, the Russians, were being quite nasty with some of them, sort of saying, "What are you doing sitting around? Just get out, go home." And they're like, "Can we?" Because they hadn't seen what it would have been like 2 weeks beforehand, when it still had a full. So that's what the Red Army was seeing, and we think of Russians as being very hard, being very masculine, being very don't give a monkeys. And I was reading in this book reports of soldiers just breaking down crying, like big, strong Russians crying at what they were having to deal with.
I mean, approximately 9,000 prisoners were left and 600 children, most of those twins. Now, you also have to remember that Dr. Mengele, who's a very famous, very famous name in Nazism, was at Auschwitz and had experimented on these children. As Penny said, what you've got left, the people that were left, are in no fit state to go anywhere either. They're not physically able to go anywhere. And the children they're coming across, they've been there for years. You know what I mean? Growing up, having experiments done, they're confused. They have no, human connection.
No free thought patterns.
No
free thought patterns. No.
You've got to remember the mindset. So when the Red Army come in, you've got the disbelief from the soldiers of actually what they're seeing and how the hell do we deal with this?
They'd had no warning. They'd had no warning from their superiors what they were going to see.
Exactly. Their orders are to push the Germans. We're on the attack. We're winning this. Push the Germans. Clear it. Kill. Just win this. Then they come across these camps. They came across Auschwitz itself, and so many sub-camps surrounding it as well. And the conditions that they're seeing and the people that they're seeing are so malnourished, disease-ridden, no food, no water has been left, obviously. Yeah. Absolutely horrendous circumstances. Now, Penny found some details on some of what was left, because like we say, do you want me to read these out? Yeah, they tried to cover it up. So there was paperwork had been burnt. They'd actually tried to burn some of the things that they'd found, but failed.
They'd blown up the crematorium. They'd blown up their offices. They'd set fire to some of the huts, wooden huts that basically were so flammable. They had wooden beds in them. They would add straw mattresses. But there was an area in, I think it was in Auschwitz I, that was known as Canada. And Canada... and again, this actually, I can feel myself. I'm going to go in a minute, Kerry. So I'm warning you. This is where people, when they were first shipped to the camp, were allowed to bring a certain amount of possessions with them. They were allowed to bring luggage weighing about 50 kilograms, I think was the maximum, and that was taken straight off them. And all their clothes were taken. They were stripped off. They would have their hair cut off. The women had all their hair cut off, and all this stuff was sent to this thing called Canada. And the reason the prisoners called it Canada was they thought Canada was a land of free and wealth and happiness, and that's why they called it Canada. And all the belongings were taken there to be sorted. So the Germans would keep cash. They had cash apparently in every single denomination. They had jewels, they had antiques, they had everything. But that wasn't just it. They were using women's hair for bedding, for rope. They were binding it and then selling it. And they decided they wanted the Jews' clothes, the prisoners' clothes, I should say correctly, because there was a lack of, they were worried about a lack of clothes in Germany, and they wanted to make sure there was enough clothes for all their people. And when sorry, this gets me more than a lot of things. When the Red Army broke into this area, they found 370,000 men suits. These are rough figures. 837 coats and women's dresses. Numerous children. 837,000. Sorry, thank you. 837,000 women's coats and dresses, numerous children's clothes, numerous children's toys, pots and pans and all that kind of thing, 14,000 carpets, 44,000 pairs of shoes, and 7.7 tons of hair that had been packed ready for shipping, which they estimated would have been from 140,000 women. Now, I know if anyone goes to Auschwitz, you can see the displays of gold teeth that were taken. The gold teeth were taken out of prisoners once they died, and that was the Sonderkommando. They had to do that. You can see the glasses. But what gets me whenever I've seen any of these displays, and it got me, there's a display at the Imperial War Museum. I think it's Sobibor or Majdanek. And they've got some of their shoes, and these are real shoes, and you can see the people's footprint, and I can't imagine walking in somewhere and seeing that, because you've only got a few thousand people out there, but a few thousand people are not going to produce 370,000 men's suits. So just by seeing that,
it brings it home. It brings it home to you. I think when you
see
see that, it brings it home to you. The quantities that we're discussing here, because to say 100,000 people or 1,100,000 people, it's hard to get your head around that of exactly how many people that is. But when you see when you see something like that, the shoes or the clothing and stuff, that is where it becomes a reality. It becomes more tangible to people.
Yes.
Now,
and I mean, sorry, go on.
Oh, she's in a bit of floods over here, girls. And guys, she's having a moment. We did say before we came on air that we didn't know if we'd get through this show without crying. Because it is so horrendous. And what we've seen doing the research for this show has been horrific. Absolutely horrific. And to distill it down to an hour was incredibly difficult, obviously, because there is so much we could have discussed on this. But I wanted to focus on what happened after the liberation. Yeah. Because, like I say, the bit whilst it was in operation is fine. It's very well documented. But there is... It doesn't end. I don't think it ends because... You've now got the Red Army going. Now, one of the first things they did their best for the people that were in there. But what they were dealing with was so extreme and so unexpected, they didn't have the resources themselves to do it. Now, they did get in contact with the Polish Red Cross. And the ones
we set up a hospital there in February.
Yeah, they did set up a hospital within the camp itself to try and get these people back to living. But a gargantuan task. You've got to remember, you're in a war zone, you're in a war-torn country that's been ravaged across the way. So there is inadequate food supplies, there's inadequate medical supplies, you've got people who can't help themselves effectively. No. They're not in a position to help themselves.
Do you want to take on the food? The food situation. It wasn't just they had inadequate food, they didn't realise how malnourished these people were, and so they started to give them normal food, and some of them died. I mean, this is just mind-blowing. Some of them died, a lot of them actually died, because they were given normal food and their stomachs burst.
Well, it's called refeeding syndrome, isn't it? Which we see in anorexics quite a lot, which is where you've starved, or the body has been starved so much from nutrients and stuff, it cannot then start processing normal food. No. This became very, very apparent to the English when they went into Belsen.
Belsen,
the refeeding. And they ended up doing like a turmeric kind of thing to try and restart. But these people are trying to help, and people are dying in masses because of this refeeding syndrome that's going on, and they can't understand it. So you've got a massive learning curve as well, and trying to actually help these people. People are dying by the droves still post-liberation because of this, as well as, the TB that's going on, the tuberculosis that's going with general malnourishment.
Everything else is still rampant,
that's going on. You've got to remember, they haven't got, decent sewers and decent drainage. There's dead bodies all around. There's, there is piles and piles of ash that were humans at one point. This is the conditions that they're living in. The huts are absolute shacks. I think shacks is probably a better word for it. So the conditions that the Red Cross staff and some of the Red Army people that stayed, they then sort of like shirked their military duty and stayed in the camp to help. You know, and local volunteers went in as well when they realised the real extent of what was going on. To try and help these survivors' needs was a task that we can't even imagine to this day. No. You know, how they managed to do it. Bearing in mind, you've also got these people. They're not all the same language and the same nationality. No. So you've got lots of different languages. You've got lots of different diseases going on. And to try and then source where these people came from, who they are. I mean, I know one of the figures I read, 7,000 letters were sent out just by the Red Cross alone to try and help the patients locate family and friends, because they were so displaced at this point. Bearing in mind, a lot of them are not local people. These are people that have been shipped in from God knows where.
Everywhere. Think of somewhere in Eastern Europe and they would have been shipped in from there.
Where do you go?
Actually, not just Eastern Europe, France, Greece, all of those kind of... Well, that's the thing, when you look at, you know, if we fast forward, and I do want to say that even though people have criticised the British, they criticised the Russians, they criticised the Americans for not bombing these places, for not doing this, there was reasons they didn't do that. I do have to say that. And there was an accidental bomb dropped on Auschwitz in about 1943, and it was dropped accidentally. They were aiming for the IG Farben building at the Auschwitz 3, the camp there, Monowitz. And it accidentally hit the train line where the ramp was, where they'd the Jews, the prisoners would get off, and it killed about 40 of them. And that's one of the reasons they didn't want to bomb it, because they didn't know who they could bomb and who they couldn't, and they didn't have precision bombing just to take out the crematorium. So when people say, why didn't they do that? Well, they didn't have precision bombing then. It wasn't like it is now, like laser targeted. They would have killed a lot of, or maybe those people would have wanted to die, I don't know. But when you think there was around 8 million people uprooted during these cleansings, 8 million, only 6 million of them by the September of 1945 had actually returned to their original countries. So that means there's around 2 million who have no state. They have no family to go back to. They are stateless. And this is one of the things, the impacts, when I was reading the stories about survivors, they said that was a thing. They didn't have an identity anymore. No. They couldn't say, like you and I could say we're English, because they could say they're English, but they had no passport. They had no ID documents to prove they were English. All people knew is that they were a bit scummy and a bit weird. And you had these ones trying to go back to the house that they'd been removed from, that had been their family home for 100 years. And locals were taking it over and were quite aggressive to them. And they realised they weren't necessarily being aggressive because they were Jewish or been in a camp of some distinction. It was they were scared they were going to ask for their possessions back, and they didn't want to give them up, because a lot of these people's possessions hadn't necessarily been taken by the Nazis. It had been taken by neighbours. Once they see that person get arrested from their house, they'd moved in and taken over. That I can't comprehend. So you have that. So you've got 2 million people who are stateless, have no identity, have no family, maybe are living in the hope that someone will find one of their family, but in the majority of cases I read, they never did.
No.
And that's just one of the things. And then you've got all the other countries saying, well, we can't take them in, we're struggling to rebuild ourselves. And a statistic that I found, that Britain agreed to take 1,000 orphaned Jewish children from the camps, right? They only managed 732 because they couldn't find 1,000.
Says it all, really, doesn't it?
That I was just like, what? And I was reading it, and it was saying they agreed to take 1,000. I was like, well, why are they talking about only? It was girls and boys, so it wasn't. They call it the boys, the boys' rescue, but it was girls as well. And I was like, well, why did they only do 732? Why did they only fly 732 to Britain? It's because they couldn't find 1,000 children still alive who were orphaned, and that. And then you've got those that did manage to go back, say those who went back to Poland and went back to, there's a place called, and I'm going to try and check how to pronounce this because it's one of those ones, Kelsa, you probably know the pogrom I'm going to talk about. There was pogroms, like attacks on Jews when they went back to their homes.
Anti-Semitism was alive and still going. It was still going.
42 Jews were killed on this day. So even a year and a half in this case, after they've been liberated, they are still living in fear of some sort. you've got even now. I was reading a report from people who work with some of the Holocaust memorial type centres, and they're saying it's mainly children now who are still alive, who were obviously camp victims, and they're saying the common things: they have problems with eating, they're scared to eat in front of people, they're scared their food's going to be taken away, they hoard food, they're really, really bad at hoarding food, they will eat spoiled food because they're scared they may not get any more. A lot of them suffer more. The women suffer with osteoporosis. It's more common in camp, and children of. They even say women who were pregnant whilst in the camps and gave birth, their children suffer with a lot of these illnesses as well. Higher rates of certain types of cancer. And then we touched on the Mengele thing. Whilst he wasn't the only doctor, there was doctors before them that were looking at mass sterilisation projects. And I mean, those we're not going to talk about, but they were horrific. So you've got a lot of these community who did get out who are now sterile because of the lack of malnutrition when they're going through puberty, or they've been forced to be sterile, and they had no money. All their things have been taken. They had no money. They had no family. They had nowhere to go. And in fact, I was reading that one of the quite a few of the Russian POWs who were there till the end, of which there wasn't many, they were then arrested by the Russians afterwards and seen to be a German spy and were sent to the gulags. And you just think these people could not get a break.
No.
And when you think of that kind of impact, what they went through, the horror those little children went through, what they were being done to them, and we're not going to talk about that. But I mean, one of the things that they wanted to see if they can make people look Aryan by making their brown eyes blue.
Yeah.
That was one of the experiments. And you think they went through this, and yet even when they come out, they've got no one. These are little children who don't know how to love, who don't know how to allow an adult to cuddle them because they're so scared about what it might mean. They don't have an identity. They don't know. In one of them, she was saying that when she goes to have medical checks, because all her family was killed, all of her family, and they ask her, do you have any hereditary illnesses, like they do, like heart disease or diabetes, and she has to say, I have no idea. And they'll be like, oh, are you adopted? No. My family was all murdered. I don't know. None of them made it past 25, 30. And it's that kind of no identity.
No. You've got to remember, whole communities were wiped out. You'd get one person survive out of one community. They'd go back to where their community was and find that was it. They weren't wanted there either. So you ended up with Auschwitz ended up becoming a displacement persons camp. So people that actually had left went back to where they came from and then decided they went back to the camp because they didn't know where else to go.
Yeah.
Now, by now, the camp obviously was a more, I hate to say positive because even then it wasn't positive, but it wasn't, we've moved on from that time. But they went back to the camp, and a lot of these people that went back to the camp actually ended up becoming the curators of the camp because they wanted to set it up as the memorial. Don't forget, we won't forget the people that died. So they turned it into almost like, and as I say, I hate to say a positive because it's not a positive, but it's a memorial. It became important for the people that survived to so we don't get this, it never happened. It is a standing monument. It is a standing memorial to the millions of people that passed through that camp and got killed. And that, I think, was what got me, was the fact that they're so displaced. They then ended up curating it and turning it into a memorial. Having said that, a lot of destruction took place after the liberation. Wood was taken. You've got to remember the communities themselves in the area were strapped for resources, so they would go in and take wood from the shacks, from the huts. They would, anything that they could get their hands on was actually taken a lot by the local populace because they needed the wood. Also, you've got to think burning wood for warmth. That sort of thing was done. So a lot of the deconstruction of the camp was actually down to this dismantling by the local populace. But that was because they themselves were in a terrible
dire
state.
straits.
Dire straits. So the question I need to ask, I think, at this point is what would you do? What would you do?
At which point?
You're liberated from this, and then you find you're totally displaced. You've got nothing, like you said. You've got no documentation to prove who you are, or you've got no money, you've got literally nothing but what you're standing up in, what would you do? Because it is very easy to go, well, I'll do this and I'll do that, and I'd stand up to the SS guards while I was in that, but you forget the demoralisation that went on, and the taking away everything that makes you human. They took away, from your belongings to your papers to even your hair. They took away everything from you. You're then left, you have to rebuild your life, and you're physically unable to look after yourself at this point. And then when you do get to the point where you're strong enough to leave and maybe try and find your family and community and find that that's all gone, what would you do? How would you cope with that?
I don't know, because thankfully I have never ever, and hopefully never ever will be, in that situation. I think I would never judge when I read a book recently, I don't know if you've read it, Kerry, called The Tattooist of Auschwitz, and it's a novel, but it's a faction novel. It's based on the story of the guy who was the tattooist of Auschwitz. And he sort of says in the non-novel bit, people judged me. I was inflicting pain on people. I was having to do it on the children. Now, they only tattooed those who weren't going straight to the death chambers. So that was only about 20% of people who had these tattoos. That's a quite scary statistic to think of as well. But he said, I was doing what I could. By being a tattooist, I had access to things that I could then give to the other prisoners. Now, I'd like to think if I was... And there's the follow-up to that book is about, and again, true, is about a woman who she was having an affair with one of the senior officers, and she got really when the Russians captured her, they treated her really badly because they knew she had nice things still, and they knew why. I wouldn't judge her for that, because she used her position to save some people who were going to get shot. She used her position to get privileges for her friends as much as she could. I think I would be like that. I like to think that I would use what I could to help other people. I don't think I'd have the guts to stand up. I mean, I'm, almost tongue-in-cheek, I can be quite gobby when I want to be. No, I don't think I would be, because I wouldn't want to risk that they'd attack my friend who was with me to penalise me for being gobby. I wouldn't want to do that, yeah? But I like to think that, if they gave me a job that wasn't particularly nice to do, if I felt that doing that job I could help people, if I felt like befriending some officers, I could help some of my campmates, I think I would try and do that. When it comes to what would happen when I was liberated and I had no identity, I don't know, it depends how mentally damaged I am. If it happened to me now, I'd probably reinvent myself. I would. But that's me having lived the way I've lived. Having lived through that, I don't know. I
don't think it's a question anybody can answer.
I don't think I'd want to live anymore. I think I think I would really struggle with being alive. I would have survivor's guilt. I don't know, but I mean, some of the stories I've found of survivors and what they've achieved is amazing. And some of the people I've read about and what they've gone through and what they've done to sacrifice themselves for other people. That, I mean, the Sonderkommando uprising I mentioned, that was because they found out that basically every so often they would recycle. It was Sonderkommando, and they found out there was going to be a mass recycling, and that's why they had the uprising, because they knew what we're going to the other camp to get you cleaned up meant. So I don't even want to try and be my normal sort of. I know all the answers. I don't.
You can't. I think this is one you can't. I mean,
I like to think I'd try and help people if I was in that. I like to think that I would look at the bigger picture, that if I was doing a job that other people would look at and think I was a conspirator sort of thing, I'd try and be saying, well, look, it means I've got access to these things and I can get these to help you. But then again, and I'm not being overly dramatic, my husband, Wayne and my husband, sat and watched some of the documentary that's on Netflix, and we both said if we saw the boys get ripped away from us, we would run into the guns. We couldn't do it. If we saw the children get ripped away from us, knowing full well what was going to happen to them, and some people did know, quite a lot of people did know towards the end what was happening if people got ripped away from you, what being told to go left in comparison to going right. I think I would have deliberately run into one of the guns. I really do. I don't think I could have dealt with it. I don't think I could have lived with it.
I think different time, different
I
circumstance.
don't know.
I was going to say you don't, because different time, different circumstance, different mentality, different way of living back then. It's very hard to call that, to answer that question. Now, out of the 7,000 SS officers involved in any of the death camps, only 800 were put on trial. Now, Rudolf Hess, who was the commandant of Auschwitz, was arrested, was trialled by the Polish Supreme National Tribunal. He was hung, and he was hung at Auschwitz.
At Auschwitz, near the gate, near the Albert McFree gate. Yeah.
On that note, we've come to the end of the show. This was the Parasearch tribute to all those people that died in the camps. And on that note, we'll bid you a very good night.
You're listening to...
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to join us for more shows throughout the week. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, and the World Wide Web to keep up to date with all the shows right here on Parasearch Radio.